paper, I took away the funnel and I dumped all of this gold solution into a larger container. I also washed the beaker a few times with distilled water to make sure that I transferred everything. Okay, so now the next step was to get the gold out of this solution, and to do this, I used potassium metabisulfite. I made a solution of it by adding about 120 grams to 200 mils of distilled water. I thought this was enough to dissolve everything, but it wasn't, so I just kept adding more water until it all disappeared. Normally, I would have just dumped in all of the metabisulfite, but I thought that maybe it could be interesting to add it dropwise. The moment I did, some brown gold powder started precipitating out, but it wasn't particularly interesting. So I ended up just scrapping that whole idea and dumping in the rest of it. The potassium metabisulfite is a reducing agent, and it reduces the gold in the chloroauric acid back to its uncharged metallic form. It also reacts with leftover nitric acid though, which is why it was important to use a minimal amount of it when I was dissolving the gold. Other metal salts, like those with copper or iron, won't be reduced by this, and this whole step was to help further purify the gold. As one point of safety though, this reaction releases quite a bit of sulfur dioxide gas, which is dangerous to breathe. I'm personally really sensitive to it, and even very small amounts can trigger some asthma symptoms. So for this reason, it's extremely important to do it in a well-ventilated area, and I did it in my fume hood. I then let it sit for a couple hours to fully react, and for all the gold to settle down to the bottom.
One of the great challenges in this world is knowing enough about a subject to think you're right.
This was what I had a few hours later, and I dumped off all the water. All of the gold was then transferred to another beaker with the help of a bunch of distilled water. This was all brought to a boil, and after heating it for a couple minutes, I dumped off the water. This washing step was then repeated 4 more times using boiling distilled water. At this point, the gold is usually pure enough, but I wanted to get it as pure as I possibly could. So I decided to do another washing step, except this time with boiling hydrochloric acid. When the concentrated acid was added, it became yellow because an extremely small amount of gold was able to dissolve. The amount, like I said though, was extremely small, and it was nothing worth worrying about. This was brought to a boil, and I repeated the same thing 4 times, and each time, the solution became more and more colorless. After the last one with the acid, I did it 2 more times with boiling distilled water. Now, just as a quick comparison, if we look at the gold before the acid and afterwards, it's quite different. The color of it is a lot lighter, and apparently, this indicates a higher purity. I poured off as much of the water as I could, and then I put it back on the hot plate to dry it. When most of the water was gone, I mixed it around a bit, and I let it sit on the hot plate for another several minutes. I also occasionally stirred it, and eventually, I was left with a really dry powder. This was more gold than I had ever held in my life, and when I weighed it, it came out to be about 75 grams. Based on the carats of the chains, I expected to get about 77.9 grams out, so this was extremely close. This estimation was based on the assumption that that unknown chain was 18 carats though, but it probably wasn't. Also, the amount of gold in the other chains was probably slightly less than the carats they were marked with. Now the next thing to process was all that other scrap. I didn't include this with the main batch because I wasn't sure what was in it, so I wanted to process it separately. It all seemed to be plated or low carat gold though, so there was no point in quarting. I just jumped right to adding the nitric acid, and like before, there was a big initial reaction, but it quickly died down. I then added the liquid from the test that I did earlier on the piece of that small chain. I also added the full chain itself, that was most likely just copper and silver. This was all boiled for a couple hours, and when it stopped reacting, I figured it was done. I poured everything off, and I washed the stuff at the bottom a few times with distilled water. It looked like almost everything had dissolved, except for some of the stuff that was completely plated with gold. Then just like before, I poured in hydrochloric acid, waited for it to boil, and added small amounts of nitric acid. Eventually, almost everything had disappeared, but the solution was green here and not yellow because there was still a bunch of copper. I let this cool overnight, and in the morning, I poured in a bunch of water. Then I mixed it around, and I also added some sulfuric acid. After this, I let it sit for about an hour, and then I filtered it. It was the exact same setup as before, just with a funnel and a few coffee filters. It was eventually all done, and now the next step was to see how much gold was actually in there. So now to this, I added a solution of potassium metabisulfite until all of the gold had precipitated. Then I mixed it around, and I let it sit for a few hours. When I came back, I poured off all the water, and it was way more gold than I expected. I really didn't think I was going to get much of anything out of it, but this was a pretty decent amount. I now had to clean it up a bit, and I did the exact same thing as before, where I started with water washings, then I did some acid ones, and finished with some more water ones. I dried it on my hot plate until it was a nice and crispy gold powder, and then I weighed it. Like I said before, I really didn't expect to get much out of this, and I was really surprised that it was almost 6.5 grams. All of this was then combined with my other gold powder, and my total now was 81.6 grams. At about $42 a gram USD, this is close to $3,400, or about 4,500 Canadian. This was way more than I ever imagined I'd be extracting from my patron, considering when he first pitched it, he just said it was some gold-plated stuff. However, I was really happy it turned out this way, because it made the project a lot more fun. But in any case, the last thing that I had to do now was to melt all of this powder down into a solid chunk. To do this, it was pretty simple, and the first thing that I needed was that small porcelain dish that I got in that kit from Amazon. Then I picked up some borax from my local hardware store, and I also got out my torch. This dish had never been used before, so I had to give it a glaze. This was done by first getting it really hot, and then sprinkling small amounts of borax onto it. The major purpose of this was just to prevent the gold from sticking to the dish. When I felt that I had done a decent job, I started adding the gold. I was a bit concerned that the torch might blow the powder away, so I swapped it for the less intense one. The gold was dense enough, though, that this didn't really seem to be much of an issue, so I ended up going back to the other one. The gold started melting relatively quickly, and I just kept topping it up with more powder and occasionally with some more borax. When I was eventually done, I was left with this giant blob of gold. I let it cool for a few minutes so that it would solidify,